In medieval Europe, winter was more than just a season. It was a test of survival. For peasants, the coldest nights brought not only discomfort, but real danger. Without central heating or insulation, every drop in temperature meant greater struggle. Snow blanketed the countryside, but it didn't look magical, it looked deadly. The biting wind howled through gaps in thatched roofs. Doors made of rough planks creaked in the icy gusts. Children huddled near the hearth, eyes wide, as frost crept across the inside of the walls. Outside, the world was silent, save for the crack of frozen branches and the shuffle of hungry animals. In this world, ingenuity and ancient traditions were the difference between life and death. Over the next 2 hours, we'll explore how ordinary people, peasants, endured the harshest conditions, night after night, year after year. The average peasant home in medieval Europe was built for simplicity, not comfort. Walls were made from wattle and daub, woven branches smeared with mud and straw, which offered little protection from the cold. A thatched roof, though clever in summer, did little to hold heat in winter. Most homes had only one room, with a fire pit in the center and perhaps a hole in the roof to let smoke escape. Cold air snuck through every gap. There were no glass windows, just wooden shutters or thin animal skin stretched across an opening. When the wind blew, it felt like it came from every direction. Still, this was the heart of peasant life. Families cooked, worked, and slept together here, with the warmth of the fire and each other to get them through the night. For medieval peasants, fire was not just comfort, it was survival. The hearth in the center of the home was their only, consistent source of heat. Gathering fuel was an endless chore. Wood had to be collected daily, sometimes from miles away, and dry wood was hard to find in the wet and snowy months. In many villages, laws limited which trees peasants could cut, forcing them to gather fallen branches instead. The fire was kept burning as long as possible, often through the night, with someone waking to stoke the coals. A pot of soup might bubble quietly over the flames, doubling as both dinner and warmth. Smoke filled the air, and clothes hung overhead to dry. In the coldest nights, the glow of the fire was a sacred presence, a beacon of life in the icy dark. Without modern fabrics or thermal gear, medieval peasants had to layer what little clothing they had. First came linen, simple, scratchy, and thin. Over that they wore wool, thicker and warmer, though often rough to the skin. In the coldest months they layered tunics, cloaks, and whatever scraps of fur they could afford or barter. Gloves were rare, so hands were kept inside sleeves or close to the fire. At night, they often slept in their clothes, with cloaks pulled over their heads. There were no wardrobes full of winter fashion, just survival, through smart layering and worn-out garments passed down through generations. Clothes were patched endlessly, stitched by hand, and rarely washed in winter. Every thread mattered. On the coldest nights, warmth came not from new coats, but from the clever use of every single piece of cloth they owned. Beds were a luxury, but warmth was a necessity. Most peasants slept on straw mattresses, bundles of hay or rushes laid on wooden frames or even directly on the floor. The straw was changed regularly to stay dry and clean. Blankets were scarce, often just coarse wool or animal hides. So families slept close, very close. Parents, children, even the family dog might share a single bed, curled together for warmth. In the dead of winter, animals like goats or chickens were sometimes brought inside to share body heat. The warmth of another body was more valuable than any blanket. On the coldest nights, this simple act of closeness could be the difference between waking up and not waking up at all. It wasn't just tradition, it was survival. The fire in the hearth was so vital that someone often had to stay awake just to keep it alive. Letting the fire die during the night could mean waking up in freezing darkness. Ashes were carefully banked to preserve embers until morning. Children were sometimes tasked with waking early to relight it. If it did go out, rekindling it meant effort. Flint and steel, dried moss and luck. Some villages had a communal firekeeper or would share embers with neighbors. Fire was life, and no one took it for granted. Its glow lit the faces of those gathered around it. Its crackle was a lullaby. In homes filled with draughts and bare feet, it was the only line between warmth and winter's full bite. Even in sleep, the fire demanded care. In some villages, homes were built closely together, not just for space, but for warmth. Walls shared between houses meant less exposure to wind. Thick stone or packed earth held daytime heat longer into the night. In colder regions, peasants built partially into hillsides or used sunken floors to trap warmth. If one family had a strong fire, the neighboring home might feel its faint benefit through a shared wall. Sometimes, entire families lived in longhouses, with animals stabled under the same roof, the heat from cows and pigs rising to warm the sleeping area above. It wasn't elegance, it was survival. The architecture of poverty became a defense against the cold, and even the placement of homes was guided by a need older than beauty, the need to endure. What peasants ate could help them survive the night. Warm, hearty foods gave internal heat and strength. Stews were a winter staple, pottage, a thick mix of grains, root vegetables and bits of meat if lucky. Cooking was done over open flames, often lasting all day. The thicker the stew, the better it held warmth. Eating just before bed helped generate heat through digestion. Some families added herbs like garlic or onion to improve circulation, even if they didn't know why it worked. Warm drinks made from herbs or even just hot water helped fight the chill. Though their meals were simple, they were designed for endurance. Every bite was both fuel and warmth. They didn't count calories, they counted nights. In the dead of winter, the line between barn and home often blurred. Livestock were a precious resource, but they were also living heaters. Chickens, goats, even pigs might be brought indoors. Their body heat helped raise the temperature of the room, especially if the house was a single open space. Some homes were built with animal stalls at one end and family living quarters at the other, separated only by a low wall. The smell wasn't pleasant, but it was accepted. Warmth was warmth. Children might fall asleep listening to the soft breath of a cow or the quiet rustling of hens. The presence of animals offered comfort and warmth that no blanket could match. Insulation in the medieval world meant using what nature and necessity provided. Peasants stuffed cracks in walls with straw, moss, animal hair, or cloth scraps. Rugs made of woven reeds were hung on walls to block wind. Tapestries were for the rich. Peasants used old blankets or sacks. Windows were sealed with oiled parchment or thin leather. In some regions they built windbreaks of brushwood around their homes. Hay or earth piled around the outside walls added another layer. Every barrier mattered. These efforts didn't make homes warm, but they made them survivable. The peasant house was not a shelter of comfort. It was a patchwork fortress against the cold. Life slowed in winter, but routine was essential. Peasants rose with the sun, though mornings were dark and bitterly cold. Firewood was gathered early, before snow hardened the ground. Animals were fed quickly to keep them from freezing. Children helped with chores, while still rubbing sleep from their eyes. Midday brought the warmest hours, used for repairs, food preparation, or mending clothes. Nightfall came early, and with it the cold deepened. Evenings were for gathering, storytelling, or silent huddling near the fire. There was little leisure. Winter was a task, not a season, and every day of it had to be earned. There was no escaping the cold. It seeped into bones and breath. Inside, water froze in bowls overnight. Bread grew stiff, and ink turned sluggish. Every task, washing, dressing, even talking, was slower. Feet never felt truly warm. The cold made tools brittle and muscles ache. Yet peasants kept moving. They didn't complain. They adapted. They layered thicker, worked closer, and moved constantly. Fires helped, but the cold was always there. It shaped their posture, their pace, their lives. For them, winter wasn't a pause in the year. It was a presence, heavy and silent, sitting in the corners of every home. When the sun disappeared, so did safety. Night was the coldest time and the most dangerous. Darkness hid ice-covered paths and lurking predators. Wolves were real threats in some regions. Without lanterns, peasants used torches or small candles, but mostly stayed indoors. The cold outside could kill, but even inside, danger lingered. Fires left unattended could die or spark a blaze. Illness thrived in the damp and dark. The body's temperature dropped with sleep, making the early morning hours the most deadly. But peasants were resilient. They prepared. They stayed close. They made it through each night with fire, instinct, and a kind of courage that didn't speak. It endured. Warmth had its own language. A shared blanket was an act of love. A neighbor bringing dry firewood was worth more than gold. A mother wrapping her baby in layers of worn linen spoke volumes without a word. In the harshest winters, warmth became the currency of kindness. It was offered in shared meals, open doors, and extra embers from the hearth. Even songs had warmth in them. Quiet lullabies passed from mouth to mouth, soft against the whistling wind. The medieval peasant didn't just survive the cold. They shared their survival. In this way, they created not just warmth, but humanity. Faith gave hope when fire and food ran low. In churches colder than homes, peasants prayed for strength, for health, for spring. Religious holidays like Candlemas and Epiphany broke the long dark, reminding people that light would return. Candles were lit not just for saints, but for warmth, however small. Stories of saints who endured the cold became legends that warmed the heart. Some peasants wore amulets or hung crosses over doors. Others sang hymns beside their hearths. Faith wasn't a luxury. It was a tool, like firewood or straw. In the coldest nights, belief in something beyond the freeze helped many endure what the body could not. For peasant children, winter wasn't magical. It was survival training from a young age. They learned early to gather wood, feed animals, and help tend fires. Their hands were red from cold and raw from work. There were no mittens, just sleeves pulled over tiny fingers. They played less and helped more, especially during the darkest months. Sleeping with siblings wasn't just comfort, it was warmth. A mother might tuck them in with whispered stories, but the cold still crept through the walls. Illness was common, and many didn't survive their first winters. Yet those who did grew up strong, weathered by frost and shaped by resilience. Winter raised them as much as their parents did. Cold brought more than discomfort. It brought disease. Winter meant coughs, fevers, frostbite. With little knowledge of germs, peasants relied on herbal remedies and folk medicine. Elderberry, garlic and honey were prized. Herbal teas brewed over the fire with yarrow or thyme offered comfort. Warm poultices were applied to aching limbs. Fevers were treated with prayers and sweat. Sickness was fought with warmth, both physical and spiritual. Midwives and wise women offered advice passed down through generations. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't. But every remedy was rooted in hope and necessity. In a world without doctors or medicine, the smallest act of healing meant everything. Wool was the winter armor of the medieval peasant. It was scratchy, thick, and invaluable. Spun from sheep's fleece, it was woven into tunics, cloaks, hats, and blankets. Even poorly spun wool trapped heat, and wet wool still insulated. The wealthier peasants had multiple layers. The poorer made do with what they had. Some slept beneath raw fleece, unspun, just to hold heat. Wool was bartered, patched, and passed down. A woolen cloak could mean survival on a frozen night. Peasants often raised their own sheep, not just for food, but for fiber. Spinning and weaving were daily tasks in winter. The cold stitched itself into their lives, and wool was the thread that held them together. Though peasants worked year-round, winter slowed everything. Nights were longer, and bodies rested more. Some historians suggest a kind of seasonal hibernation, long stretches of sleep, waking only to eat, tend fire, or care for animals. The cold made rest essential. Movement burned calories and food was limited, so conservation mattered. Homes fell silent after sundown. Under heavy cloaks and piled straw, families dozed through long winter nights. It wasn't laziness, it was survival. Sleeping more meant shivering less. In those quiet hours, dreams offered a world warmer than their own. Rest was refuge. In winter, the village wasn't just a place. It was a lifeline. Neighbors checked on each other, shared firewood, food, and warmth. If someone's fire went out, others offered embers. If illness struck, a neighbor brought broth. Help wasn't optional, it was expected. Survival depended on each other. Festivals and shared meals gave brief light in the dark months. Community meant shared burdens and shared joys. When wolves howled or snow collapsed a roof, no one was left alone. In this way, the cold drew people closer, not just physically, but in spirit. In winter, the village was a blanket that wrapped around everyone. At night, someone often stayed awake, not just to keep the fire alive, but to watch. Bandits, wolves, or even fire could threaten the family. It was a quiet task. Eyes open, in a dark room, ears tuned to the wind. The watcher stirred coals, checked shutters, and listened. Sometimes it was the oldest man, sometimes a child on their first long winter vigil. Fear and cold were companions. Stories told of spirits wandering. In winter, of beasts that hunted the breath of sleepers. Whether real or imagined, these fears kept people alert. Winter was a season of both silence and suspense. Surviving winter wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Cold wore down the body, but also the spirit. Laughter, songs, and stories were more than entertainment. They were medicine. Peasants told tales by firelight, sang old songs, and played simple games with bones or carved wood. Even in poverty, joy was a rebellion against the cold. A shared smile, a clever joke, or a playful moment with a child, these were sparks that lit the soul. Winter tried to dull their light, but peasants fought back with memory, music, and community. The cold could steal warmth, but not wonder. By February, the cold felt endless. But even then, peasants looked for signs. A bird call, a thawed stream, a green shoot under snow. They dreamed of longer days, of planting, of warmth. Seeds were counted, tools prepared, stories of spring were told to children. The memory of sun on skin became a prayer. Even as snow still covered the earth, hope stirred beneath it. That hope was their fire when the hearth ran low. Spring wasn't just a season, it was a reason to survive one more night, a reason to hold on. March crept in slowly. Snow melted, mud returned, and roads became rivers of slush. It was still cold, still hard, but there was movement. Tools came out. Roofs were mended. Livestock moved more freely. Though food stores were low and bodies were tired, the rhythm of life began to rise again. Children laughed louder. Fires burned a little brighter. The long sleep of winter was ending. It didn't happen all at once, but peasants knew they had made it. Against all odds, against every frozen night, they were still here, still alive, still together. So how did medieval peasants survive the coldest nights? Not with technology or comfort, but with wisdom, community, resilience, and fire. They knew the land, their homes, and each other. They used what they had, and nothing went to waste. The cold was their teacher, shaping habits and hearts. They endured not just through warmth, but through will. And through this, they left us a lesson that survival is not just about strength, but about care, of fire, of family, and of each other. Their winters were brutal, but they survived. And in doing so, they proved that even in the coldest night, the human spirit still burns. Fire was more than heat, it was life. A single spark could mean the difference between survival and death. Peasants guarded their hearth like a sacred place. Ashes were never wasted. They insulated beds or were used in cleaning. Coals were buried in pots to carry fire from house to house. Some families paid others for embers if theirs died out. Fire was used to dry clothes, warm food, heat stones for beds. Its smoke cured meat and even healed wounds. When the wind howled and walls creaked, fire whispered, "You're not alone." Peasants prayed beside it, dreamed near it, lived by it. It was the heart of every winter home. Peasants didn't have modern insulation or thermal wear. They had layers, undergarments, tunics, woolen cloaks, furs if they were lucky. Each layer trapped precious warmth. Linen was worn closest to the skin, often kept dry while thicker materials went outside. They tucked clothing tight and belted everything to stop cold from slipping in. Even legs were wrapped with wool strips, an early version of leg warmers. Head coverings were essential. Heat escapes fastest through the head. Scarves, hoods, and caps were made of anything available. Clothes were rarely washed in winter. Dirt helped block the wind. They dressed not to look good, but to live through the night. A warm bed was a rare treasure. Most peasants slept on straw stuffed into sacks or heaped on the floor. Straw trapped heat and could be replaced easily. Over it went layers of wool, sheepskin, and any cloth they had. Families often shared beds, 3, 4, even more to a pile. Sometimes heated stones were wrapped in cloth and placed under covers. Beds were low to avoid drafts. Some used small animals like dogs or even chickens as body warmers. The smell, strong. But survival mattered more than scent. Comfort was relative. Warmth was priceless. They made do with what they had, and they slept through the cold. Wood was gold in winter. Peasants gathered it year-round, stacking it high. Before snow came, they knew which wood burned slow, which sparked too much, which gave off little heat. Oak was prized, but even branches, twigs, and bark were used. Dead wood was gathered first. No one wanted to cut live trees unless desperate. Storing it dry was vital. A wet log was useless, sometimes dangerous. Children hauled bundles, women split kindling, men chopped larger pieces. Every flame started with planning. Without wood, there was no heat, and without heat, the night won. So every log mattered, every splinter was survival. Barns weren't just for livestock, they were lifesavers. During the harshest nights, some peasants slept beside animals to share heat. Cows, goats, even pigs gave off warmth. The smell was intense, but the heat was real. Hay acted as insulation, walls thick with packed mud and timber. In emergencies, entire families moved into the barn. Animals were valuable, both for food and as furry furnaces. Even chickens helped. In return, peasants made sure their animals were fed and sheltered. The bond was mutual, warmth for care. A barn wasn't just a building, it was a refuge, a place where breath and body warmth held back the dark. For many peasants, faith was a fire of its own. In winter, churches became places not only of prayer, but of warmth. Candles flickered in stone chapels, and the heat of gathered bodies made services bearable. Priests offered blessings for health and warmth. People prayed for sick children, for stronger crops, for the return of sun. Stories of saints enduring cold inspired hope. Charity was shared, sometimes bread or warm clothes for the poorest. The church was not just spiritual, it was social and practical. In the dead of winter, a place to hope together was often as vital as food or fire. Winter meals were plain, but traditions gave them meaning. Porridge was common, made of oats, barley, or whatever grain remained. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots were boiled with herbs. Salted meat, if available, was saved for special days. In some villages, winter fasts were observed, both for faith and necessity. Sharing food with a hungry neighbor was a holy act. Festive days, like midwinter feasts, broke monotony. Families lit extra candles and told old stories. Even a single apple or handful of dried berries became celebration. Winter food wasn't rich, but it was ritual. Eating was survival. Celebrating it was resistance. Every village had someone who knew what others didn't, a wise woman, midwife, or herbalist. In winter, her role became vital. She knew which herbs fought fever, which bark soothed pain. She wrapped limbs, whispered prayers, and brewed teas that gave comfort. Sometimes feared, sometimes revered, she was called on when the healer's touch was needed. She taught others to preserve herbs, to gather what could still be found even in snow. Her remedies didn't always work, but they often helped. And in a world with no doctors, her knowledge was power. She kept the fire of memory alive. Peasants read the snow like a book. Tracks told of wolves or lost livestock. Patterns in the frost warned of storms. A red sky at morning, a ring around the moon. These were omens. They watched how birds flew, how dogs behaved, how trees cracked in the cold. Nature was their guide and their warning. Children learned early to notice small signs. Snow melting faster near certain routes, icicles dripping differently. There were no weather forecasts, just experience. Knowing the snow's language could save a life. It was wisdom passed by mouth and memory. In winter, the world spoke quietly. The peasants listened. Sometimes even the best preparation wasn't enough. Fires went out. Wood ran low. Illness came. In those moments, peasants didn't panic. They endured. Blankets were piled higher, bodies huddled tighter. They moved less, ate slower, prayed more. In silence, they waited. They had no other choice. Some nights were darker than others. Some were tragic, but others passed and morning came. Survival wasn't guaranteed, but neither was surrender. Even in the worst moments, there was always a chance the fire would spark again. And that hope, small as it was enough to get through another night. Medieval peasants knew how to fight drafts. Windows, if they existed, were small and often covered in oiled cloth or animal bladder to block wind. Cracks in walls were stuffed with straw, mud, or wool scraps. Doors were draped with heavy cloths. Floors were often layered with reeds or hay to hold warmth. Some homes had no chimneys. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, warming the rafters along the way. Every part of the house served to trap heat and block cold. It wasn't perfect, but it was clever. Peasants didn't wait for comfort. They created it, one layer at a time. As night fell, routines were sacred. The fire was stoked, animals fed, and doors barred against the wind. Clothes for the next day were placed near the fire to warm. A quick meal was shared, sometimes hot broth or thick porridge. Children were checked for chills. Feet and hands were rubbed to bring warmth. Then came quiet. Songs or prayers were whispered. Stories told by firelight passed time and passed down wisdom. Finally, bodies curled under shared covers, the day ending as it began, with hope, with care, and with community. These routines were rhythm, and rhythm meant survival. Warmth was a communal act. One person couldn't fight winter alone. Families slept in tight clusters, back to back, sharing body heat. Neighbors checked in on the old or sick. In some places, entire communities shared one fire, gathering at a central hearth. Children slept with siblings or pets. No one was left to freeze alone if it could be helped. Warmth wasn't just temperature, it was presence. Hands held together, arms around shoulders, even shared laughter brought heat. Against the long, cold night, solidarity was stronger than solitude. The cold divided, but warmth united. Nights were dangerous. Someone always stayed awake, even briefly, to tend the fire or listen for wolves. They called it the night watch. Sometimes it rotated, an hour here, an hour there. Other times the elderly, too tired to sleep deeply, sat near the fire, listening, watching, protecting. A dropped ember or open door could mean disaster. The watcher stirred coals, adjusted logs, whispered to sleeping children. It wasn't a formal guard duty, but it mattered. Even as most slept, someone cared for the warmth. For in sleep, the world stopped. But the fire must never. Dogs weren't just pets. They were guardians, companions, and heat sources. In winter, peasants valued dogs for their warmth as much as their bark. Many families allowed dogs to sleep indoors, curled beside beds or under blankets. They alerted families to intruders, hunted vermin, and barked at predators outside. Their fur trapped heat, and their loyalty offered comfort. A peasant's dog might not have a name, but it had a place by the fire. In winter, when breath frosted and the wind howled, the thump of a tail or the press of a warm muzzle could mean peace, and sometimes survival. Winter didn't only bring cold, it brought illness. Coughs turned dangerous, fevers spread quickly. There were no antibiotics, only hope, rest, and herbs. Onion poultices, garlic soups, and steam from boiling herbs were common remedies. Blankets were piled high over the sick. Water was warmed and given slowly. Sometimes prayers were all that remained. Many feared the chill in the lungs, what we'd call pneumonia today. Death came quietly in winter, not with a scream, but with a sigh. And yet peasants resisted it with everything they had. The battle wasn't just against frost, but against the silence that came after. Movement was life. Peasants knew that. Sitting still too long in the cold invited death, so even indoors they kept active. Chores were done slowly but constantly. Spinning wool, mending clothes, grinding grain. Blood had to move. Even when resting, hands kept working. Older folk wrapped their joints tightly. Children were told to dance or stamp their feet. Inactivity chilled the bones. The body wasn't just surviving, it was preserving itself. Warmth came from within, and peasants knew how to coax it out. Rest was saved for true sleep. During the day, even in the coldest rooms, life must move. Children weren't spared from winter. They were part of the fight. They gathered sticks, helped tend fires, fetched water, and comforted younger siblings. They were taught early how to wrap themselves tight, how to warm hands, how to listen for danger in the wind. But more than that, they brought joy. In the harshest cold, their laughter was defiance. Their games, even simple ones, stirred life in sleeping rooms. They chased chickens, sang silly songs, and whispered secrets under shared covers. Children reminded peasants why survival mattered. Their strength was not in size, but in spirit. They made winter worth enduring. Even in bleak winters, peasants found time to celebrate. The midwinter festival, sometimes around the solstice or Christmas, was a time of hope. They burned a large log, the Yule log, to ward off darkness. Bread was shared, sometimes honeyed if supplies allowed. Stories were told, songs sung, dances danced. It didn't erase hunger or cold, but it lit a candle in the dark. Community was reaffirmed. Children received small treats, nuts, dried fruit, a piece of cheese. And for a night, laughter echoed louder than the wind. Winter was paused, if only briefly. Joy was rare, but powerful. Every winter taught something new. Elders passed on stories of storms survived, tricks to keep fingers warm, plants that healed, and animals that warned of danger. Children listened close. It could mean their future survival. No knowledge was wasted. Even the way smoke moved in the wind was a clue. Oral tradition was the true library of the peasant world. What worked was remembered. What failed was learned from. These lessons weren't written, but they lasted. And year after year, winter after winter, those stories became shields. In the coldest nights, memory became a map to morning. Wool was the medieval peasant's armor against the cold. It was warm even when wet, thick, and could be woven at home. Peasants spun wool from their own sheep, turning it into cloaks, socks, mittens, and caps. Layers of wool trapped warmth close to the skin. Children wore hand-me-downs patched again and again. Even walls were draped with woolen cloth to keep out the chill. It was rough and scratchy, but it saved lives. In villages where money was scarce, wool was wealth. Not gold, not silver, wool. Snow could be deadly, but also useful. It muffled sound, hid dangers, and made travel hard. But peasants used it cleverly. They packed snow against walls for extra insulation. They melted it for water when rivers froze. They read snowdrifts like maps, learning wind direction and tracking animals. Some even built windbreaks from snow to protect homes or animals. The coldest white blanket was both trap and tool. To survive, peasants didn't just fear snow. They studied it, used it, respected it. Winter meant no fresh harvests, so peasants relied on smoked and salted food. Meats were hung above hearths to dry in smoke. Fish were salted in barrels. Root vegetables like turnips and onions were buried in cool cellars. Grains were kept dry in sacks or jars. Food preservation wasn't just smart, it was necessary. A single spoiled batch could mean hunger. Peasants used ash to keep bugs away and stored apples in straw to last longer. Every preserved bite was a promise. You'll eat tomorrow. Music brought more than joy. It brought movement, memory, and morale. Around the fire, peasants played simple flutes, lutes, or drums. Even a wooden spoon on a pot became rhythm. Songs told stories, warned of winter spirits, or praised the coming spring. Singing together stirred the blood and lifted spirits. Some melodies were centuries old, passed down like sacred spells. Even in cold that froze breath mid-air, a voice could rise and remind all, we are still alive. Winter brought long, oppressive darkness. Candles were rare, made from precious tallow or beeswax. So peasants relied on firelight, glowing coals, or rushlights dipped in fat. Shadows filled corners. Night began early and ended late. Darkness shaped moods and movement. Work stopped sooner. Children feared what lurked beyond the fire's reach, but they adapted. Night was used for stories, mending, planning. Darkness was a prison and a canvas. Peasants didn't defeat the dark, they endured it. When ponds froze and rivers turned to ice, water became precious. Peasants broke ice, daily to collect it, carefully lest they fall in. Wells were shielded, sometimes covered with straw mats. Buckets cracked if left out too long. The act of getting water could be deadly. Some walked miles to find a spring still flowing. Others prayed for snow because snow could melt. Thirst in winter sounds strange, but in a frozen world, water was as hard to find as fire. The forests were silent in winter, but not empty. Wolves howled in the distance, boars rooted through snow. Peasants feared these woods, yet entered them for fuel, food, or herbs. They left offerings for forest spirits, whispered thanks, and stuck to known paths. A snapped twig meant danger. A silent forest meant predators nearby. Survival meant listening with more than ears. The woods were teacher and threat. One wrong step could end a life or save it. Hope was not a luxury. It was fuel. Every sunrise that cracked the ice reminded peasants that winter would end. The promise of spring planted seeds in the soul. Hope was found in a child's breath, a steaming bowl, or an animal that survived the night. Even laughter, brief as a spark, was a rebellion. Without hope, winter conquered the heart first. But peasants held tight to it, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. No peasant survived alone. Neighbors shared food, firewood, and stories. When one family's roof collapsed, others helped. If someone fell ill, soup was brought. Help wasn't charity, it was survival math. You helped today, so you might be helped tomorrow. Even strangers were welcomed on storm nights. The fire was shared. The cold was not. Community wasn't a word. It was a blanket wrapped around everyone. The cold could take much, but never their shared humanity. Sometimes snow fell like a secret, soft, slow, and sacred. In those moments, even peasants paused. They watched the world turn white and quiet. Tools were set down, fires hummed, children poked heads from under blankets. The snow didn't speak. It hushed, it covered mistakes, tracks, blood, and pain. For a moment, the world was pure again. Peasants knew it wouldn't last. The cold would bite again. But for one breath, one snowfall, even suffering stilled. That was winter's strange gift, silence, and the strength to begin again. By midwinter, the earth itself turned to stone. The ground was frozen solid, too hard to dig, too cold to sit on. Graves were delayed. Crops couldn't be planted. Even walking was dangerous. Ice turned roads to traps. But peasants adapted. They layered straw on paths, wore shoes stuffed with moss or wrapped in cloth. Some used wooden sleds to carry goods instead of carts. When the ground won't yield, the body must bend. So they did, step by cautious step. Without chimneys, many homes filled with smoke. Fires burned low to conserve fuel, but still the air grew thick. Eyes watered, children coughed, roof holes helped, but not much. Still, smoke had benefits. It killed fleas, preserved meat, and warmed the roof beams. People got used to it. Some believed smoke kept away evil spirits. The air might choke you, but it also wrapped you. A strange comfort, like a wool blanket, full of ash. One garment wasn't enough. Peasants wore layers, linen shirts, wool tunics, cloaks, scarves. Hands were wrapped in strips of cloth, feet layered in wool and leather. Even bedding was stacked, fur, straw, rags, blankets. Every layer trapped warmth, and as the night deepened, more were added. Layers meant more than clothing. They were strategy, skill, survival. A thin peasant could feel like a knight wrapped in armor, of warmth. Even in winter, life moved on. Villagers gathered for markets, often shorter, faster, colder. Goods were bartered, salted meat, dried herbs. Candles, cloth, fires were lit in barrels to warm hands. People came bundled, red-faced, quick with trade, and quicker to leave. Still there was laughter, news, gossip, a reminder. The world hadn't frozen completely. Life still bartered and breathed, even if the breath steamed in the air. Faith warmed what fire could not. Peasants prayed for spring, for health, for mercy. The church offered shelter, bread, and hope. Candles flickered beside icons, casting long shadows. Saints were invoked. St. Blay for throat illness, St. Bridget for hearths. Religion wasn't just belief, it was structure in chaos, light in darkness. When the cold crept under doors and fear stirred in the chest, peasants whispered prayers, not out of weakness, but strength. In the deepest part of night, when even the fire gave only whispers, silence became sacred. It wasn't emptiness, it was presence. The wind howled outside, but indoors was still. In that silence, peasants listened to their breath, to the creak of beams, to life itself. It wasn't peace in comfort, but peace in awareness. The cold stripped away distractions. What remained was simple: breath, fire, heartbeat. And in that, peasants found a kind of calm that warmth alone could never give. The hearth was more than heat. It was the home's beating heart. Around it life circled, cooking, stories, drying clothes, warming hands. Children played at its edge, elders guarded it. Fire was never left alone. Ashes were stirred like soup. A good hearth meant safety, a failing one meant danger. It was fed like a child, tended like a wound, loved like a friend. In a world of ice, fire was life, and life began at the hearth. Old age was rare and revered. Elders carried winter in their bones and wisdom in their words. They knew how to read frost, how to stretch food, how to heal coughs. Their stories weren't for entertainment. They were blueprints. When a storm came, it was the elder who knew when to seal the door, when to burn the last log, when to wait. Their presence was comfort, their memory was map. In winter, every wrinkle was a page of survival. One day, the air changed. The snow didn't stick. A bird called. Water dripped. From eaves, these tiny signs stirred something ancient. Peasants stepped outside. Faces lifted, eyes narrowed. Carts creaked again. Doors stayed open a little longer. No one declared winter over, but they hoped. A child found a sprout beneath the snow. A lamb was born. The long night began to break. Not suddenly, but steadily. Winter never ended with a shout, only a whisper. When winter passed, it didn't vanish. It left its mark. Cracked hands, empty cupboards, new stories. The survivors counted what was left. Tools, animals, people. They mourned what was gone, but they stood, scarred, tired, stronger. Winter didn't break them, it shaped them. Like wood in fire, they emerged tempered. And with the first seeds planted, they began again. For peasants, survival wasn't a victory shouted from rooftops. It was a quiet nod, a breath, and the will to face the next cold. The first true thaw was a celebration. Snow melted in rivulets, running down paths and into fields. Mud replaced ice. The sound of dripping water was like music. Peasants moved slowly, testing the ground. Boots sank, wheels stuck, but no one complained. Wet feet were better than frozen ones. Chickens scratched again. Cows lowed louder. The world was waking, and so were they. The thaw didn't fix everything, but it meant one thing. They had made it. Winter broke more than spirits. It cracked walls, warped doors, shattered tools. So the thaw brought work. Roofs were patched with fresh thatch, fences rebuilt, sleds turned back into carts. Even clothes needed mending. The village rang with hammers and voices. Children helped, or at least tried. It wasn't glamorous, but it was healing. Every nail struck was a claim. We are still here. Spring was not rest, it was repair, and peasants knew strength isn't in surviving once, but again. Winter was a world of whites, greys and browns, but now colour crept back in, slow and sure. Grass poked through soil, birds flashed red and gold. Cloth once hidden under cloaks was seen again. Blue skies returned, though still shy. Flowers hadn't bloomed, but their promise was felt. After months of dullness, even the faintest green felt loud. Peasants noticed. They always noticed. In a world of survival, beauty mattered, not as luxury, but as life's bright whisper. A frozen field softened under sun. Ploughs returned, oxen pulled slow and steady. Hands once wrapped in wool now gripped handles again. Planting didn't wait. Peasants turned soil still cold beneath, knowing delays meant hunger. Seeds were precious. Each one planted with hope and calculation. Children followed, scattering. Elders watched, nodding at the rhythm. The land was no longer enemy. It was partner again. The long sleep was over. It was time to grow. Even as the body worked, the spirit healed slower. Grief from loss lingered. Weakness clung. But laughter returned in bits and pieces. Jokes. Around meals, songs during planting, neighbors who hadn't spoken since frost now shared bread. Spring festivals were prepared even if food was tight. A dance, a prayer, a new baby's cry. Each was a thread in the tapestry of hope. Peasants knew suffering well, but they also knew joy was not forgetting pain. It was surviving it. With the return of longer days, light was celebrated. Bonfires were lit, not for warmth, but for joy. Feasts were held, no matter how small. Peasants sang around the flames, faces lit with golden glow. They told stories of the cold months, of who was lost and who endured. Firelight danced in their eyes. Light had returned, and with it, gratitude. It wasn't the grandest festival, but it meant the most. We are alive. We are together. We remember. Winter always took some. Elders, infants, the weak. In spring, the dead were buried with care. Graves dug in softened earth, flowers placed, songs whispered, names spoken aloud. There was no marble, only wood, earth and memory, but each grave was a vow. You were part of us. Mourning wasn't hidden, it was woven into life. Children asked questions, adults answered gently. The cold had passed, but the love remained, and so did the stories. Spring was for teaching. Young ones learned how to tend animals, plant crops, watch the skies. Elders passed on lessons of winter, how to find shelter, make fire, store food. These weren't just chores, they were survival skills. Peasant children didn't learn from books. They learned from doing, watching, listening. Every task was a seed planted in their minds. Someday they too would face the coldest nights. And when they did, these lessons would keep them warm. Even as spring bloomed, thoughts turned to next winter. Firewood was gathered early, herbs planted for cold remedies, tools sharpened, plans made. Peasants didn't wait. They prepared while the sun still shone. Survival wasn't reaction, it was anticipation. The cold would come again, but next time they would be ready. Because survival was not luck. It was skill, memory, and the will to act before the storm. Medieval life was shaped by the seasons, and winter shaped the soul. It taught patience, resilience, community. Peasants didn't fight the cold. They lived with it, adapted to it, survived it. Each spring wasn't just a season, it was proof that life continued, that strength endured, that hardship was not the end, but the forge. From the coldest nights came the warmest truths. Life is fragile, precious, and worth enduring. For Mashus, as days lengthened and warmth returned, life regained its rhythm. The bells rang again, markets buzzed. Chores no longer felt desperate, they became routine. The chaos of winter was replaced by the slow dance of the seasons. Peasants woke with the sun and worked until twilight. There was peace in repetition, in knowing what comes next. The fear of freezing was replaced by the hope of harvest. In this return to normal, they found strength. Winter had turned neighbors into survivors. Now they became a community again. Tools were shared, walls repaired. Together, a new roof raised by many hands. The cold had reminded them of their need for one another. Bonds deepened, old grudges faded. Around shared meals, laughter returned. Not every day was easy, but they were no longer alone. That was the true victory of surviving winter, finding each other again. Peasants owned little, but what they had they knew deeply: a sturdy cloak, a trusted blade, a cup mended 3 times. Simplicity wasn't poverty, it was intimacy. Every tool had a name, every bowl held memory. In winter, there was no space for excess. Spring reminded them that they had enough, that survival wasn't about having more, it was about knowing what mattered. And that kind of knowledge kept them strong, no matter the weather. As fields turned green, songs filled the air. Old melodies, sung for generations, echoed across hills and meadows. Children learned verses as they worked. Ballads told of past winters, brave souls and quiet victories. Music was memory. It reminded them who they were and what they'd faced. In those notes, peasants didn't just remember, they celebrated. The songs of survival were sung softly, but they rang louder than any storm. Though the hearth fires dimmed with spring, another fire remained, the one inside. Winter had tested them, but it had also lit a flame of resilience. Every hardship endured had fed it. Every loss remembered had shaped it. Peasants didn't just survive. They adapted, learned, grew. That fire wasn't loud, but it was lasting. In every calloused hand, every tired smile, it burned quietly, the will to live, to carry on, to face the next cold when it came. Spring was the season of new life. Babies born in the cold now cooed in cradles. Toddlers took their first steps on green grass. These children would never know the full pain of the last winter, but they would inherit its lessons. Peasants didn't raise children just for love, but for continuity. Each child was a promise to the past and a wager on the future. In their laughter, the village found healing. Winter left marks on homes, on fields, on skin, but around each scar, new growth appeared. Weeds were cleared, soil tilled, wounds healed slowly but surely. Peasants didn't hide their scars, they honored them. A cracked beam reminded them of the storm survived. A limp reminded them of a brave rescue. These signs weren't weakness, they were proof of strength. Spring didn't erase winter, it grew through it. As spring deepened, peasants turned to rituals, simple, sacred acts of hope. A ribbon tied to a tree, a candle lit for the coming harvest, bread baked in silence. These weren't grand ceremonies. They were quiet acknowledgments that life continued, that blessings could return. In a world so often ruled by chaos, these rituals gave structure. They didn't control the world, but they centered the people within it. The same sky that once dropped snow now held blue promise. Peasants watched clouds for rain, stars for time, sun for direction. The heavens weren't distant, they were a guide. Birds flew higher, winds shifted, all were signs. To survive meant paying attention. Looking up was not escape, it was understanding. Peasants didn't need clocks or calendars. They had the sky. And the sky had always told them what they needed to know. Even in spring's full bloom, peasants knew the cold would return, maybe in months, maybe sooner, but they were no longer afraid. They had faced it and come through. Each season was a teacher, each storm a lesson. The memory of the coldest nights never faded, but it no longer ruled them. Instead, it became part of their strength. They would be ready next time, because winter could take warmth, but never will. The land remembered. Paths worn by desperate feet in winter hardened in spring. Footsteps became trails. Shelters built in haste were reinforced for next year. Everything left behind was a lesson. Peasants read the earth like a book, each rut, each rock, each patch of moss. They learned where the wind bit hardest, where the snow drifted deepest, and they built smarter. The land didn't forget, and neither did they. Throughout winter, one task never ceased: keeping the fire alive. In spring, that duty became an honor. The firekeepers, often women, elders, or children, were now celebrated. They had kept the hearths burning, quite literally keeping death away. Now they passed on their secrets. Which wood burned longest, how to coax flame from embers. Fire had been their ally, and its guardians, the unsung heroes. Survival began not with strength, but with spark. Cold forged iron, but it also forged friendships. Those who huddled together for warmth now shared something deeper than mere survival. They had seen each other's fear and strength, shared meager meals, held each other through coughs and tears. Spring didn't dissolve those bonds, it strengthened them. Now they visited more often, shared more freely. In the coldest nights, trust had grown like roots in frozen soil. And in spring, it bloomed. Scarcity teaches selfishness or sharing, and the peasants had chosen the latter. Now they remembered who had helped whom. A widow given soup, a sick boy given boots. These kindnesses weren't forgotten, they were returned. Spring was the season of giving back. Those who had received now gave, not because they were rich, but because they understood. When cold returned, they'd do it again. Survival, they knew, wasn't about one, it was about all. Winter didn't end with the snow. Its memory lived on in stories. Around fires and fields, peasants told the tales. The blizzard that blocked the barn door, the child. Born on the coldest night, the wolf tracks near the well. These stories weren't to frighten, but to remember. They were warnings, lessons, reminders of strength. In every laugh, gasp, and nod, the past came alive. Winter taught them to remember. Spring taught them to speak. Every wall patched, every door reinforced, was a memory set in wood and stone. Peasants didn't rebuild to erase the past, but to honor it. Some carved dates into beams, others scratched names into door frames. These weren't just homes, they were chronicles. The buildings told their stories, of cold endured, of warmth reclaimed. In each nail a promise, we survived, we will again. Children who had seen their first winter now practiced for the next. They learned how to stack wood, mend boots, boil herbs. Not through lectures, but through hands-on work. Peasant education wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. The old watched proudly as the young mimicked their movements. In each task, a future protector of the hearth. Winter was no longer a mystery to them. It was a challenge they would be ready for. The hearth was more than fire. It was the soul of the home. In spring it still held its place, though now used less. It was kept clean, honored, ready. Every meal began there, every prayer ended there. Even as flowers bloomed outside, the hearth remained a reminder. Warmth was sacred. To keep fire was to keep life. Peasants never took it for granted. They had seen what life was without it. Medieval peasants lived with balance, not by choice, but by wisdom. Too much taken from the land, and the earth gave less. Too much stored and food spoiled. Every action had weight. Winter had taught them limits. Spring reminded them of abundance, but careful, measured. It wasn't fear, it was harmony. Survival wasn't just a fight, it was a dance. And the peasants moved with the seasons, step by humble step. There were no grand speeches, no written records, just silent gratitude, in the way hands lingered on warm stone, in the way eyes closed during the first sunny breeze, in the way bread was shared with reverence. The peasants did not boast about surviving. They gave thanks, quietly, continuously. Gratitude, like fire, was tended daily, and in that simple practice they prepared again. Not for winter's return, but for life's continuance. Each tool had a legacy. The worn axe that split 100 logs, the kettle that simmered broth through blizzards. Tools weren't just objects, they were partners in survival. Passed down, repaired, respected. Children were taught not just how to use them, but how to care for them. Peasants knew in winter a dull blade could mean death. a well-kept tool meant life. In spring, these items were cleaned, sharpened, and stored, ready for the cold to come again. Animals were more than livestock. They were fellow survivors. The cow that gave milk through frost, the dog that guarded the door at night, the hens that refused to stop laying. In spring, they too recovered. Coats shed, young-born. Peasants treated them with quiet respect because they had endured together. The barn wasn't just a shelter, it was a lifeboat, and inside, life had huddled close until the sun returned. The forest had been both threat and salvation, dangerous yet full of firewood, herbs, and hunted game. Now in spring it softened, leaves returned, birds sang. But peasants didn't forget its winter silence. They walked its paths with respect, took what they needed, left offerings, a coin, a breadcrumb, a whispered prayer. To them the woods had spirit, one that had shown mercy when it could have shown none. Mothers bore winter on their backs. They rationed food, wrapped children in their own cloaks, kept fires going long after exhaustion. Now in spring, their strength showed in the children who ran and played, in the babies who survived, in the homes that still stood. Peasants spoke little of sacrifice, but it was there, in every wrinkle, every scarred hand. Winter was cruel, but mothers were fierce, and they had won. Not all prayers were spoken aloud. Some were breathed into cold air, others carved into wood or traced in soot on stone. In winter, faith was all they had. Now in spring, they didn't stop praying, they changed how. Seeds were planted with whispered hopes, bread kneaded with silent thanks. Peasants didn't need churches. Their altars were hearths, their cathedrals, fields. Faith lived not in ritual, but in endurance. Though the snows had melted, winter lingered in memory. The village did not forget those lost. A grandfather buried in frost, a neighbor who didn't wake. They marked the names, planted trees, shared stories. Not with sadness, but with reverence. In remembering, they honored survival. Each loss was a thread in the village's history, woven into songs, prayers, and lessons. The cold had taken much, but memory, it could never freeze. As roads cleared, traders returned. But they didn't just bring cloth and salt. They brought stories of how other villages survived, of greater cold, stranger remedies, acts of courage. Peasants traded their own tales. Around wagons, under canopies, words flowed freely. Laughter, gasps, nods of shared understanding. These weren't just stories, they were survival manuals. Every village had endured differently, and together they stitched a map of wisdom across the land. In spring, peasants already prepared for next winter. Wood was chopped early, stored high and dry. Every log stacked was a step toward security. The work was tiring, but it brought peace. They remembered the desperation of an empty woodpile. They would not let it happen again. Chopping wood wasn't just labor, it was healing. A way to say, we're ready, we won't be caught unprepared. The shift was subtle. Meals became more than sustenance. They became joy. Music returned not just to pass time, but to celebrate. Peasants danced again, sang, hugged longer. Winter had reduced life to its basics. Spring allowed it to bloom again. The difference between surviving and living was small, but real, and the peasants, tired but unbroken, chose life, fully, loudly, gratefully. They knew it would return, the cold, the dark, the silence. But now they would be ready, not just with firewood and cloaks, but with memory, with story, with each other. They had faced the coldest nights and endured. And when winter returned, as it always did, it would find them stronger, wiser, not unafraid, but unshaken. Because in every frost-bitten footstep, they had learned how to live. In spring, elders were no longer just survivors. They were sages. Every wrinkle held a winter, every word a warning or a blessing. Young ones gathered to listen, not out of duty, but out of awe. The old had faced more winters than most. They knew the signs, the tricks, the truths. In every village, there was one who had the answer to, what do we do when the fire goes out? And those answers saved lives. Some homes had crumbled, roofs had fallen, doors had frozen and split. But spring brought tools, hands and resolve. Peasants didn't just rebuild, they improved. Thicker walls, better stone, new thatch. Every swing of the hammer carried memory. This time we won't break. Children helped, neighbors joined. A broken wall was not a shame. It was a chance. Winter tore down, spring rebuilt. Winter bleached the world in grey and white. Now colour returned like a forgotten dream. Green shoots, blue skies, red cheeks. Peasants paused just to look, to feel, to remember. They hung dyed cloth again, painted carts, wove wildflowers into hair, not out of vanity, but because colour meant life. It was a rebellion against the cold, a celebration that they had survived the monochrome world and brought the palette back with them. Spring wasn't just a season, it was a ritual. Wells were cleaned with prayers. Fields walked in silence before sowing. Bread baked with the first flour was shared by all. These acts weren't written in books, they lived in hands and hearts. Peasants didn't separate life from ritual. The act of surviving winter became the act of blessing spring. Each gesture a thank you, each tradition a promise. Not all heroes were known. Some left bread at doorsteps in silence. Others repaired fences no one saw. Some tended the sick without thanks. And still others stood guard on the coldest nights while the village slept. These unseen helpers didn't ask for praise. They asked for nothing, but without them, fewer would have survived. In spring, their names were whispered, their deeds remembered. In silence, they had saved lives. Peasants sang again, new songs, old tunes, verses of hunger and hope. Children clapped along, elders nodded with wet eyes. Music had been missing in the cold, replaced by wind and cough. Now it returned, full-throated and proud. Songs remembered who was lost, who was brave, who was kind. They weren't just entertainment, they were archives, and every voice was another line in the story of survival. Now the earth could give again. Peasants planted not just for hunger, but for healing, lavender for sleep, garlic for strength, comfrey for wounds. Every herb had a purpose and a story. The old taught the young which leaf to pick, which root to dry. These weren't just gardens, they were green apothecaries, grown with care, watered with memory, because winter had shown them what mattered, and medicine was one of them. Winter had created a language beyond words, a glance that meant, "I understand," a touch on the arm that said, "I'm still here." In spring, those silent signals remained. Peasants communicated through kindness, through shared work, through laughter that carried more than sound. Language was more than speech, it was presence, and in their shared hardship, peasants had learned to speak in soul. Even now, the fire still burned in every home, less needed but never forgotten. It had been their companion, their protection, their light. Peasants cleaned the hearth with care, placed flowers nearby, not as decoration but as tribute. Fire was more than flame. It was survival incarnate. And as they laughed and lived again, the embers reminded them life is fragile and warmth is sacred. From the coldest nights, they carried forward not just firewood and scars, but wisdom, compassion, endurance. Every lesson, every shared loaf, every silent night mattered. Spring did not erase winter. It gave it meaning. The peasants stood not as victims of the cold, but as students of it. And as the days grew longer, they lived more fully because they had known what it meant to nearly lose life, and now they honored it. Children who survived the winter were different, stronger, quieter at times, but more curious. They had seen hardship early, yet spring gave them laughter again. They played games rooted in survival. Who could build the best fire with twigs? Who could find hidden food in the woods? Even in play they were learning, because their world had taught them. Survival wasn't something you waited for. It was something you practiced, even when the sun was shining. Though the cold had been cruel, it had taught them things warmth never could. It taught patience, resourcefulness, unity. It exposed what truly mattered and what didn't. The peasants didn't long for winter, but they honored what it had shown them. The cold stripped life bare, and from that bareness they rebuilt truth. In every woven blanket, every shared laugh, the gifts of the cold lived on, quiet but present. Not all tools were made of wood or iron. Some were made of memory, a lullaby that helped a child sleep during a storm. A story passed down about the frost of '98, a carved symbol in the beam above the door, marking the year they almost didn't make it. These were tools too, mental, emotional, spiritual, passed down like heirlooms, carried like torches in the night. Among the villagers, a quiet respect was held for the firekeepers, those who stayed up the longest, who rose the earliest, who never let the flames die. Their hands were always smudged with ash, their eyes heavy, but they were the reason the rest had warmth. In spring, these firekeepers were honored, not with riches, but with thanks, meals, hugs, because every ember that survived winter had a keeper behind it. Now the world had fully awakened. Trees stretched higher, fields shimmered with green, birds returned. The village buzzed with activity, yes, but also peace. It had made it, scarred but whole. The peasants knew the cold would return, but they also knew something more powerful, that life always pushes through, that after silence comes song, after cold, color, and that no matter how dark the night, they would always find the will to light the fire again. The lessons of the winter didn't stay hidden in one home. They were shared. In markets, over fences, at wells, use moss, not straw, to seal wind gaps. Boil bark for tea if herbs run out. Knowledge flowed freely. No one hoarded wisdom, because in a harsh winter, information could be as precious as fire. And the more they taught, the more they ensured not just their survival, but everyone's. The sky darkened again, not with winter but with spring storms, thunder, heavy rain. The peasants didn't panic. They had faced worse. Roofs were sealed, animals secured, firewood kept dry. The storm came, loud and wild, and passed, and the village stood strong, because survival wasn't just about the coldest night. It was about facing whatever came next, with hands ready, heart steady, and a memory that said, "We've been through worse." And the children who had huddled close to the fire now carried kindling themselves. They learned to chop, to mend, to cook, not because they were forced, but because they wanted to be ready. The older peasants watched, proud. A cycle was continuing. The future would face its own winters, but it would not be helpless. These children would know what to do. They had been born in survival and raised in strength. Now every meal was a celebration, every warm night a miracle. A full bucket of water, a dry cloak, a shared joke. These were not small things anymore. They were gifts. Peasants gave thanks not in loud prayers, but in the way they lived. They shared, they cared, and every kindness became a ritual of gratitude. Because when you survive the worst, even the smallest comforts shine like stars. As night fell, the village quieted. One by one, hearths glowed. Not out of fear now, but out of ritual. Fire had become more than heat. It was heritage, a living. Memory passed from one season to the next, and as each family tucked in, they knew the coldest nights had not broken them. They had forged them. The fire would burn forever, not in wood, but in spirit, and in that they were truly unshakable. They didn't call themselves heroes, they didn't write poems or build statues, but they were survivors. Every man, woman, and child. Each had faced hunger, fear, and frost, and each had emerged into spring with stories etched in soul. When travelers came through, they didn't speak of grand castles or kings. They spoke of this village, the one that endured, that stood together, that never let the fire die. On the eve of midsummer, they held a quiet ceremony. One by one, children lit small torches from the great hearth. not for warmth, but as a symbol, a gesture that said, "We will carry what you taught us." The older ones stood back, watching, remembering. The flames danced like memory itself, flickering, moving, alive. And in every torch, the promise, we will survive the cold again, together. They began to compose songs not just about the spring, but about the winter itself. Ballads of bravery, chants of unity, lullabies that remembered the silence and praised the warmth. These were not songs of sadness, they were songs of triumph, because they could now sing of the cold with reverence, not fear. The music didn't erase the struggle, it transformed it. Clothing held stories, each stitch a winter's tale. Mothers taught daughters how to mend not just fabric, but the spirit. A patch was not a flaw, it was a badge. Scarves passed from grandfather to grandson. Gloves that saved hands were kept like treasure. They didn't wear rags, they wore resilience. Layer upon layer of lived experience, sewn with care and dignity. Beyond the fields lay the forest. In winter it had seemed hostile, dark, frozen. But now it revealed its secrets: bark for medicine, mushrooms for food, moss for bedding. The forest had always been generous, if approached with respect. The peasants didn't conquer it. They listened, learned, gathered, and gave thanks, because the forest too had helped them survive. Their homes were not made by architects, but by instinct. Stone for strength, wood for warmth, but above all, willpower. A peasant's cottage wasn't just shelter, it was a shield. They reinforced what cracked, replaced what rotted, and always built with hands that remembered the cold. Each home was different, but all had one thing in common. They stood because their builders refused to fall. There were nights when one home's fire died, when illness or sorrow left them too tired to keep it alive. That's when a neighbor stepped in, carried a burning log across the snow, lit a new flame with steady hands. The gift of fire was never denied, because sharing warmth was the first law. No one survived alone, and in the darkest hour, a flame freely given meant everything. Some of their most powerful moments weren't loud, they were still. Faces glowing in firelight, a hand squeezing another, tears quietly falling, then being wiped away. These were the moments where survival took root, not in grand gestures but in presence, in being there, in staying. The fire lit more than rooms. It revealed the human spirit, etched into every face by flame. Their knowledge spread. Travelers took their stories to other towns. Priests preached of their endurance. Even nobles came to ask, "How did your people last the winter?" And the answer was always the same: together. Their survival became more than a local triumph. It became legend, not because they had magic, but because they had each other. And that was the greatest magic of all. And so, the cycle would return. Summer would ripen, autumn would fall, and winter would come again. But the village no longer feared it. They prepared, not with dread, but with love. Because now they knew the coldest nights weren't the end. They were a test, a forge, and in every soul that had faced them, the fire still burned, quiet, steady, eternal. Winter preparation wasn't only physical, it was spiritual. As the leaves began to fall, the village priest reminded them, "A warm heart keeps the cold away." Prayers were whispered not out of fear, but from habit, wishing health for neighbors, strength for the weak and calm for the restless. In silence and faith they found peace. They prepared their souls as carefully as their shelters. Not everyone made it through the cold. Each winter left behind names never forgotten. At the edge of the village, a simple memorial stood, wooden markers, sometimes just stones. Every year before winter they visited the site, not with sadness, but with thanks. Those who passed had taught them, strengthened them. They honored the lost by surviving well. As the frost returned, so did the lessons. Chimneys were cleaned, windows sealed, extra firewood collected, not just for themselves, but for the sick and old. Winter's approach was never ignored. It was respected, because even after many seasons, the cold still had things to teach, and the wise were those who never stopped listening. The greatest defense against the cold was kindness. A loaf left at a doorstep, a cloak passed to a child, even a story told by fire could warm more than hands. It warmed hearts. Kindness was their armor, forged not in steel, but in shared humanity. And though winter could steal warmth from the air, it could never steal it from their souls. They watched the sky like a book. The color of clouds, the flight of birds, the halo around the moon, all whispered of what was to come. Elders would nod quietly. "Snow tomorrow." And it came. Their knowledge wasn't magic, it was memory. They had read the signs year after year, and each one helped them stay a step ahead of the cold. Even animals were part of their survival. Chickens roosted closer, goats and dogs slept indoors. Birds were fed scraps, their presence considered good luck. The peasants didn't rule over nature, they shared space with it, and the more they gave, the more the world gave back. The cold was easier to face when the barn breathed warmth and the animals felt like family. Not every hour was filled with work. Sometimes survival meant stillness. A quiet moment staring into the fire, the sound of snow tapping the roof, a warm drink held with both hands. In stillness they recharged, they reflected. The world outside may have frozen, but inside, in those silent moments, time melted. Peace was part of survival too. They didn't carry riches, they carried memory. In a worn spoon, in a fire-stained pot, in a bundle of herbs tied with string. Every object had meaning. It wasn't about how much they owned, it was how deeply it mattered. Because when the cold came, what saved them wasn't wealth. It was wisdom, passed down in simple things, lovingly kept and carefully used. From the outside, they looked fragile. Thin clothes, old homes, tired eyes, but beneath that surface was iron, a strength not seen but felt. They laughed when they could have cried, they gave when they barely had enough. That strength didn't shout, it endured. Winter saw it, and every time it tried to break them, it failed. And still the cycle turned. The cold would come. The fire would rise. The people would endure. Because their story wasn't just about one winter, it was about all winters, past, present, future. They had learned not only how to survive, but how to teach. And so the circle continued, an unbroken chain of warmth passed hand to hand, heart to heart, across generations. In winter, sound changed. The wind sang different songs, howling over roofs and through trees. Inside, the crackle of fire became a melody. Wood splitting, pots bubbling, boots stamping, these were the rhythms of life. The peasants didn't need instruments. The season itself composed music, and as they listened, they found harmony even in hardship. Each night, one candle was lit and placed by the window, not just for light, but as a signal. "We're still here," it said. "Come if you need warmth." Sometimes travelers came. Sometimes neighbors did. The candle was a promise. No one faced the cold alone. Even the smallest flame shared could push back an ocean of night. Smoke told stories too. From the fields they could see which homes had burning fires. Thick, steady smoke meant warmth and life. No smoke, trouble. They watched the sky for signs. Grey wisps above the roofs like silent messengers. It wasn't gossip. It was care. A way of watching over one another when words weren't needed. Sometimes survival came in tiny moments. A frozen bucket, thawing just enough to drink. A rabbit snared when the traps had been empty for days. A stranger offering salt. These weren't accidents. They were miracles in plain clothes. The peasants saw them not as luck, but as signs that winter didn't own everything. Life still whispered, "I'm here." There was something sacred about a line of boots drying by the fire. Wet leather steaming, lined up like soldiers who had returned from battle. Each pair told a story of a walk through wind, snow, and effort. And in that quiet line of shoes, the family saw evidence. We made it back. We're still walking. Silence wasn't emptiness. It was strength. When the wind outside howled, families sat together in stillness. No need for words. The warmth of presence said enough. It was a silence full of meaning, a silence that healed. In the heart of the storm, that silence was a shelter all its own. The smell of baking bread could defeat even the bitterest cold. A rising loaf meant hope, warmth, and fullness. Even when flour was scarce, they found a way. A mix of roots, seeds, dried berries. They called it winter bread. And though it was rough and humble, it tasted of survival. Every crumb a victory. Each night, someone stayed awake. They took turns. Old men, young boys, mothers nursing infants. The fire must not die. The wind must not sneak in. The night watcher didn't speak or move much. Just sat, eyes open, listening, protecting dreams with presence alone. The cold never got past the watcher. Not all of winter was cruel. There were days of breathtaking beauty, trees glazed in silver, air so crisp it rang like a bell. Children, sledding on frozen hills, cheeks red with joy. Snowfall so gentle it felt like a blessing. The peasants didn't just endure winter, they saw its gifts too. The beauty that came only to those who stayed. In time, the peasants realized something remarkable. The cold hadn't broken them, it had built them. Every frostbite scar, every empty night, every shared cloak, it all forged a people who were strong, wise, and deeply human. They didn't just live through the coldest nights, they were shaped by them. And in that shaping, they found meaning. When the worst of the cold passed, there came a moment, the first cautious step outside. Snow cracked underfoot, trees dripped. The wind was still sharp, but no longer cruel. They looked up. The sun was pale, but it was there. That single step was more than movement. It was hope walking again. Even under snow, the land mattered. After storms passed, peasants walked the edges of their fields. They touched frozen soil, counted fence posts, checked for signs of life. The earth slept, but they stayed close, like visiting an old friend in bed, because when the thaw came, they would rise together. Healing didn't wait for spring. It started in winter's final breath. Bruised hands wrapped in cloth, cracked lips soothed with lard and herbs, souls mended with sleep, stories and laughter. Even before the snow melted, wounds began to close. Life had paused, but never stopped. And now, slowly, it moved forward again. Then one morning they heard it, a song. Not from mouths, but from branches. The birds had returned, just a few, cautious but singing. The peasants stood still and listened. In that small, trembling music, they heard everything: survival, return, and the promise of life. It was the song of spring arriving on feathered wings. The day came when they opened their doors wide, not just to let air in, but to say, "We are ready." The homes aired out, blankets were shaken, light streamed where there had been only firelight. The cold hadn't defeated them. Now they welcomed what came next, not with fear, but with strength. Some neighbors hadn't been seen in weeks, but with the thaw came footsteps. One by one, doors opened, hugs were exchanged. "You made it." "I did." No feasts, no trumpets, just nods, laughter, and shared bread. The village was whole again. The cold had separated them, but survival pulled them back together. With winter behind them, they reached for the future, seeds. Carefully kept through cold months, these tiny grains now passed from hand to hand, each one a possibility. They didn't plant them yet, but holding them was enough. It meant they had something to give the earth again, and the earth would answer. Boots needed patching, roofs needed fixing, tools needed sharpening. Survival didn't stop when the cold ended, it just changed shape. With calm hands, they repaired what had carried them through. These weren't chores, they were thank yous, gratitude made visible in every stitch, nail, and polish. Around the fire, they told the children what had happened, not to frighten them, but to prepare them. Here's how we kept warm. Here's how we didn't lose hope. Little hands touched old tools. Wide eyes watched. The past wasn't locked away. It was given freely, because one day they too would face the cold. They knew the cold would return, not tomorrow, not next week, but one day. And that was okay. They no longer feared it, because now they carried fire not just in their homes, but in themselves. So when the next winter came, they wouldn't just survive it. They would greet it like an old rival and say, "We are ready." They once believed the fire that saved them came only from wood and stone. But after all they had endured, they knew better. The real fire was inside them. It burned in every act of kindness, every shared crust of bread, every hand held in darkness. That inner flame never froze, never flickered. It kept them human.